Hello everyone, good afternoon. My name is Jedidja from Boven. It's a real pleasure to meet all of you, albeit digitally. I wish I could have been there in person, but I'm still here digitally, and it's really my honor and pleasure to be presenting with you. I will be presenting some of the insights for my master's thesis, which I'm nearing completion of for my master's in Euroculture at the University of Groningen and Jagiellonian University in Krakow. Although I will say I've adjusted the themes of it a little bit just to fit the theme of the conference. So I'll be talking a bit more about others of paganism than I did in the final analysis of my actual thesis. But I'm just picking out a couple of things that I think might be interesting just to shed some more insight into the Dutch context. So hopefully I can represent that a little bit. So something that I noticed when we heard your remarks from Professor Sriska this morning is that tendency to turn inward when paganism is being studied. And I did find when I was trying to decide on a topic for my thesis last year that there's really extensive scholarship on particular groups, particular paths, if you will, and even particular countries. But that often in a lot of this work that the societal embedding or decontextualization for these movements is often missing, that it's really relegated to kind of classical cultural anthropology approaches, and that the sociology of religion seems to not really have caught up yet in some ways. But as we've seen in the last panel, paganism, much like any other religion, doesn't exist in isolation. And because of that, I really wanted to take an approach that would keep kind of the contextual factors into account. So once I'd settled on that, it was time to choose a particular case, and on that I settled on something close to home. My research is on the Netherlands, which is a country where paganism has actually not been studied super extensively. There are exceptions, and to their work I'm very grateful because they've done very important work in kind of mapping paganism in the Netherlands. Here I'm thinking of Jentel Schattenvoet, as well as Wilhelm van Gulik, who's done a lot of cultural psychology work on Wicca in particular, and especially Hanneke Miet-Jan, who has just completed her PhD thesis last year, which is called Nehelenia's Lowlands, if anyone is interested. It's a very extensive mapping of various pagan movements in the Netherlands, and I very strongly recommend it. At the same time, we've seen a renewed interest in Dutch popular culture in paganism and in pagan themes. Radio shows inviting a witch to come speak in a radio show. Events like Castlefest are really, really huge. In one of my questions this morning, I mentioned the band Heilung. They have a huge following in the Netherlands, and they started playing live events at Castlefest in the south of the Netherlands. So there's that aspect as well. And finally, the Netherlands is kind of known in the literature as having a somewhat pluralist religious landscape. The country loves to kind of advertise itself as being very tolerant, although I find that really depends on which group you're a part of. Nevertheless, though, it is definitely true that there has been some form of religious diversity in the Netherlands, whether that's within Christian denominations or in a wide variety of religions. Before I move on, this picture on the left that you see is from a church in Meerveldhoven, which is in the south of the country, called Onze Lieve Vrouw ter Eik, which is Our Lady of the Oak. It's one of the only churches in the Netherlands that has actually kept the tree with which Virgin Mary was associated. That connection exists in a lot of churches, but this is the only one in the Netherlands where the church was built around the tree rather than chopping down the tree. So it's become kind of a symbol within Judith Schrijf's work, who talks a lot about kind of the pagan remnants in the Dutch public sphere of this connection between different religions in the Netherlands. Before I move on to what I found in this case from the Netherlands, I do want to do a little bit more contextualization. My background right now is actually in European studies rather than in religious studies, so in that way it is very important for me to keep that broader perspective in the picture as well, and to kind of illustrate that and my focus on that. I've picked out a quote from Kieran Flanagan's book of Sociology of Spirituality. This is from the introduction, and I'll read it out to you. Collective memory evokes a sense of loss, of nostalgia for times of the golden age, when the gods touched the rims of culture and made them spin in animation and exaltation. as modernity moves memory on, an increasing awareness arises that in the cultural cracks affected by progress, something of the spirit has escaped. Paradoxically, the powers of modernity to destroy the gods produce forces that seek their resuscitation. Life in the Dead Sea of modernity generates its own revolts, but also its own projects of recovery. So Flanagan, and this is echoed in authors like Paul Heylassen and also Peter Burke in his book The Homeless Mind, it really talks about the ways in which modernity and religion intersect, and they talk a lot about the European case in particular, in which Christianity is no longer the identifying characteristic of the continent, which it presented itself as for such a long time, but it's not really the case anymore. And because of that, there's this loss of identity and this loss of connection with oneself. And so what I found is that, especially in secularization studies, even though there's a debate going on there that is very lively and still very much inconclusive, I find that even the harshest critics of secularization as a process find that modernization affects religion, especially when it comes to institutions, but at the same time that religion can also be used as a means to cope with modernity, and this is something we also spoke about earlier this morning. So there is this embedding that is happening in Dutch case as well. So this represents my sample a little bit for this research. These pins that you see in the map of the Netherlands are not all the cases I've talked to, but they are the cases that I've interviewed in person or that were kind of tied to the place in which they lived, that they made it explicit where they were living at the time of the interview. So as you can see geographically, it's pretty well divided, and this also goes for the demography of the group. It's a very diverse group of people. Also when it came to their affiliation. So my thesis is really about contemporary paganism as a whole. So I talk to people from the goddess movement, people from Masaryk, people from Druidry, various kinds of witchcraft as well, shamanism. So a really wide group. And the area that I've highlighted here is the Bible Belt, the Dutch Bible Belt. The Netherlands is sometimes presented as a very secularized country, but that really depends on which area of the country you're in. There's a pretty large part of the country that is still quite Protestant, Calvinist brands of Protestantism mainly. And what I found is that even though I wasn't explicitly looking for that, a lot of the people I interviewed are actually living in the Bible Belt area, which I thought was quite interesting. Some of them are raised there and some of them moved there at a later age. But that certainly has, for many of them, affected the way in which they interact with other religions as well. And that brings me as well to what I found and kind of the others that I've identified in my research. So definitely the main suspect in this case is organized religion as a whole. So when it comes to this, the group that was mentioned most often in the interviews that I did was certainly Protestant Christianity mainly. I found that people were a bit more willing to accept certain tenets of Catholicism just because they said, well, they have many rituals as well, they're much more pagan than those Protestants. And like I said, multiple interviews in the Bible Belt, which is very, very Protestant overwhelmingly. But at the same time, atheism was also represented as an other by some people, especially people who I've interviewed who were raised in an atheist family, mentioned that they had this need for spirituality or were searching spiritually, couldn't really find it in their family, and multiple people actually explicitly mentioned, well, atheism is also a religion, and they really represented this as an other in that way. And very much related to that point, of course, is the issue of dogma and doctrine. This is probably the theme that came up the most in the interviews, which is this very strong aversion towards rules governing someone's practices, someone's beliefs. That can be anything, big or small, as well as groups that have a strong hierarchy or a strong leader. I spoke to a few people who had been involved in more initiatory kinds of Wicca, for example, even for many years, but then turned away from it because they wanted a practice that was more based off of their subjective interpretations, that veered away from rules and from hierarchy and from institutions, especially among people that were raised in within an organized religion as a child. And then on a slightly different note, we also spoke a lot about materialism and commercialization of paganism and kind of the authenticity implications that has. So I'm glad it was also brought up in the previous presentation. But yeah, we spoke about the ways in which particularly technology affects this. One interviewee mentioned the term Instagram witches or Instagram pagans, which I thought was quite interesting. So then we really spoke about people showing interest in paganism more so for aesthetic reasons than for actual religious or spiritual reasons. And when I looked into this further, I have some images for you, and I'm curious to know if anyone else is looking into kind of the social media aspect of this at all. On the left, you see a couple of screen grabs from TikTok about contemporary paganism, which has become a huge, especially witchcraft, has become absolutely huge on this platform. And on the right, you see someone from a very popular Instagram account called The Hood Witch. It's very interesting. She has a Black Mexican ethnicity and was involved in Wicca for a number of years, but found it very white and very. She didn't feel at home there, so she created her own page, and now that page is being featured in outlets like business outlets like Girl Boss, all these kind of platforms. So because of that trend, people who I spoke to, especially those that have been in the pagan community for many years, mentioned that they were kind of concerned about this trend and that they were also trying to wait out and see how that would affect their identity. And then other than that, there's a couple of themes that are just a little bit more complicated than that, or that were more diverse in terms of what people have to say about them in the interviews. One of these was globalization, which obviously means that there's a stronger connection between groups that are active in different countries, and a lot of people mentioned that this was important to them. At the same time, this also means that there's a loss of connection with local environments and local spaces. So people also express some concern about globalization in that way. Technology is very much related to this. So especially people in an older generation mentioned that it's just much greater access to information if you're interested in paganism these days, which is of course true, and that it's also easier to build connections, like I just mentioned. But at the same time, again, just turn away from the local, the idea that you would have to go to Stonehenge or to Iceland to really experience paganism rather than experiencing it in your own backyard. And also some of the conflict that happens in online spaces particularly, that is a little bit less likely to happen in in-person context. And then in addition to that, Christianity. I spoke to a lot of people who had very poor experiences with Christianity, particularly those that are living in the Bible Belt. So they mentioned a lot of stereotyping, a lot of conflict with local churches. At the same time, I also spoke to some people who were very publicly out, as they said, who were very public about the fact that they were a witch, for example. And one of them mentioned that the first visitor she ever had when she moved to her now hometown was the local pastor, who she's now been friends with for 30 years. And then someone else who interviewed from the Goddess Temple in Amsterdam mentioned that she has a very good friend who is also a pastor and is very willing to talk to her about these things. And she, I think, summed it up by saying that she would be totally fine with speaking to a Christian who's authentic in their faith. And is not trying to convert them to anything, more so than someone who is practicing Christianity because of societal pressure, family pressure, or because it's the right thing to do. So there was certainly a differentiation in that. So it was much more nuanced than the literature would sometimes make you believe. And then finally, there's the issue of individualism. There was, what I noticed, this dislike of human exceptionalism. There were multiple people who said, well, with my belief with my animist beliefs, I really don't see humans as the crown of God's creation, as the Bible says. Much more so, humans are just another animal. And then in that way, they really distance themselves from anthropocentrism. At the same time, there's a very strong emphasis on the individual interpretation of one's religious practices, the autonomy, the self. So there was there were different ways in which the individual was implied in all these interviews. And then finally, there's the issue of gender. This is something we've discussed this morning as well. There were certainly people I spoke to who were more in the kind of right-leaning Asatru kind of groups. but also a lot of people who were in more left-leaning, very female-oriented groups as well. So there were certainly different opinions about the way in which gender roles should work, or in the way in which gender would impact one's identity as a pagan. At the same time, I saw, while there was this shying away from patriarchal structures, the kind of monotheistic religions with an emphasis on the male figures, I also saw people being hesitant about things like the Wicca, which really lean into the feminine and have the kind of male deities, male roles at kind of peripheral space. So to kind of wrap up, I have this section from the website of the Goddess Temple in Amsterdam, and it's in Dutch, but it says at the top that the temple was not about vrouwenwerk, which is work on women specifically, or looking for the goddess in yourself. Rather, what is at the bottom, this is what the temple is about. It's that men are just as welcome as women, and that both goddesses and gods are worshipped. So that was a trend I maybe wasn't expecting to find as much as I did, but there was really hesitance towards leaning in any one way. Most people were quite moderate in this, so that's also why I included this in its complicated rather than in the first category. So just to conclude really briefly, for me, it really comes back to the issue of Europe constantly, because that is my background and I'm trying to connect it to the European level. What I've seen is that there is a sense of the othering of Europe with its kind of struggle with identity in the past decade. So whether that's the othering of Europe as a Christian entity, or the othering of Europe as kind of this modern, hyper-connected entity that doesn't leave much room for paganism. Either one of these two ways, there's this process of representing Europe as belonging to that globalized, technologized sphere. At the same time, I'm very wary of researchers othering pagans as well. I was very adamant about the importance of participatory research when I started on this project. I really didn't want to come into the field with this idea of alive secularization theory and I'm going to apply it to the pagan case. I really wanted to hear what participants had to say about these processes, and this is something I found among them, that they were really interested in and quite keen on sharing their thoughts on these processes. And it's something I was quite nervous about when they started, but they were very interested in sharing their opinions and in sharing their thoughts on these processes. So in that way, I think it is good to sometimes question the ways in which we structure our approaches, even if processes are quite abstract. I believe that there's some value in really contributing to this in a more participatory way. And yeah, I've really enjoyed working on this. It was really nice to be able to talk about it in this context as well. That's about it for me, and I would be happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you very much.